Before we begin tonight, I want you to think about the person you were before the moment that changed you. Not the moment you would choose to be remembered for. The other one. The one you have spent years trying to outrun, or explain away, or simply not think about too closely when the house goes quiet, and there is nothing left to distract you from your own history. Tonight, we are going to meet a man who spent 20 years running from exactly that kind of moment, and who finally, on a riverbank in the dark, with no crowd watching and no explanation offered, stopped running and started wrestling instead. Not with the brother he had wronged, not with the father-in-law who had wronged him in return, with something else entirely. Something that came to him alone in the dark, and would not let him go, and would not tell him its name, and left him limping for the rest of his life with a blessing he had to fight to receive. His name was Jacob, and by the time this story is over tonight, he will have a different one. He will also, and this matters just as much as the new name, carry a limp for the rest of his life that the blessing never once tried to erase. Settle in. Close your eyes. This is a story about what it costs to become who you actually are, and why the wound and the blessing so often arrive in the very same night, from the very same hand. We are just beginning. Chapter 1. The Heel and the Birthright. Before there was a wrestling match in the dark, there was a smaller struggle, one that began before Jacob had even drawn his first breath. Genesis tells us that his mother, Rebekah, carried twins, and that they struggled together within her, so much so that she cried out to God in the pain and confusion of it, wondering aloud why this was happening to her at all. And God answered her with a prophecy that would shape the rest of both her sons' lives before either of them had done a single thing to earn it. 2 nations were in her womb, God told her, 2 peoples, and the elder would serve the younger. Think about what it means to carry that sentence inside you before your children are even born. Rebekah knew from the very beginning that the natural order the world around her took for granted, the elder son inheriting the greater share, the elder son carrying the family blessing forward, was not going to hold in her house. She knew before she ever held either child in her arms that a reversal was coming. What she did not know, could not have known, was how much pain that reversal would cost everyone involved, including the God who had spoken it, in whatever way it is possible to imagine cost touching the purposes of God at all. Esau was born first, red and hairy, the text tells us, and right behind him came his brother, gripping Esau's heel with his tiny hand, as though even in the last seconds of the womb he could not bear to be second. They named him Jacob, a name built from the Hebrew word for heel, but carrying inside it, even at his birth, the darker shade of meaning that would come to define so much of his early life. Jacob, the one who grasps, the one who, in a slightly different inflection of the same root, deceives. The boys grew, and the text is unusually direct about how differently their parents loved them. Isaac loved Esau, we are told, because he had a taste for wild game, the kind of simple, honest preference a father might feel for a son who brought him what he enjoyed. Rebekah loved Jacob. The text does not soften this into a story about equal love expressed differently. It names a favoritism, running in 2 separate directions, through the same household, a family already fractured along invisible lines, long before anything dramatic happened to make the fracture visible. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field. Jacob was quieter, the text says, a man who stayed among the tents. And it is worth pausing on that word, quiet, because it does not mean what we might assume it means in a story that is about to show us exactly how far from passive this quiet man actually was. Jacob's stillness was not gentleness. It was patience, the stillness of someone who watches and waits and calculates, the way a man waits by a well for exactly the right moment to draw water rather than exhausting himself hauling at the wrong hour. That patience finds its first target on an ordinary day when Esau comes in from the field exhausted, famished, willing in the desperation of his hunger to say almost anything. Jacob is cooking stew, and Esau asks for some, and Jacob, instead of simply giving his brother food the way any brother might, names his price. "Sell me your birthright now," he says. And Esau, thinking of nothing beyond the immediate ache of his own hunger, answers with words that would echo through the rest of his life. "I'm about to die, so of what use is a birthright to me? I want you to hold both of these men honestly in your mind here, because it is tempting, especially once we know how this story ends, to flatten Esau into a simple fool and Jacob into a simple villain, and neither reading does justice to what the text is actually showing us. Esau's hunger was real. His willingness to trade something enormous for something immediate is a very human failure, the kind most of us have committed in smaller forms 100 times over, choosing the comfort in front of us over the harder, slower good that requires patience to receive. And Jacob's calculation was real too, a willingness to exploit his own brother's weakest moment for permanent personal gain, which is its own very old and very human failure, dressed up here in the language of a fair trade. The birthright changes hands over a bowl of stew, but the birthright alone was not the whole of what a firstborn son carried. There was still the blessing, the formal spoken pronouncement a dying father gave to mark which son would carry the fullness of the family's future forward, and that blessing had not yet been given. It would take one more deception, a much darker one, before Jacob held that too. Chapter 2. The blessing stolen in the dark. Isaac grows old. His eyes, the text tells us, had grown dim so that he could no longer see, and sensing that his death might not be far off, he calls Esau to him and asks his favorite son to go out and hunt game, to prepare the kind of savory meal Isaac loved, so that he might eat it and give Esau his blessing before he died. Rebekah overhears this, and here the story takes its darkest turn, because what happens next is not simply Jacob seizing an opportunity the way he had seized the birthright over the stew. It is a plan, carefully constructed, initiated by his own mother, drawing her favored son into a deception aimed directly at his blind and dying father. Rebekah tells Jacob to bring her 2 young goats from the flock, and she prepares the savory food herself, cooked the way she knows Isaac loves it. She dresses Jacob in Esau's clothes, so that he will carry his brother's smell into his father's tent. And because Esau was a hairy man, and Jacob was smooth-skinned, she covers Jacob's hands and the smooth part of his neck with the skins of the young goats, so that if his blind father should reach out and touch him, he would feel the coarse hair his fingers expected to find. Jacob hesitates, and it is worth noticing exactly what he hesitates over, because it tells us something important about where his conscience actually was at this point in his life. He does not object to the deception itself on moral grounds. He objects on grounds of risk. "My brother is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man," he says to his mother. "Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse upon myself instead of a blessing." His fear is not that this is wrong. His fear is that it might fail, and that its failure might cost him rather than reward him. Rebekah answers simply, "Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice." He goes into his father carrying the food. Isaac is suspicious almost immediately, something in the timing feeling wrong to him, even without his sight to confirm it. "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" he asks, and Jacob answers with a lie that reaches chillingly for God's own name to cover it. "Because the Lord your God granted me success." Isaac calls him closer, wanting to touch him, to feel with his hands what his eyes could no longer confirm, and the text gives us one of the most quietly devastating lines in the entire scene. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Isaac feels the goat skins and is satisfied, or perhaps not fully satisfied, but no longer certain enough to refuse, and he eats, and he blesses his younger son with the blessing meant for his elder, the blessing of abundance, of nations bowing before him, of lordship over his own brothers. Jacob has barely left his father's tent when Esau returns from the hunt, prepares the meal his father asked for, and comes in expecting the blessing that was, by every right of birth and every expectation of custom, his to receive. Isaac trembles violently, the text says, when he understands what has happened, a trembling described with a word elsewhere used for the shaking of mountains. And Esau, hearing that the blessing is gone, cries out with what the text calls an exceedingly great and bitter cry. "Bless me, even me also, O my father," he begs. And there is nothing in the whole of Genesis more heartbreaking than the plainness of Isaac's answer. "Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing." Esau weeps, and in that weeping something shifts in him from grief into a resolve that will hang over the rest of this story like a shadow that never quite lifts. "The days of mourning for my father are approaching," he says to himself. "Then I will kill my brother Jacob." Chapter 3. 20 years of running. Rebekah hears of Esau's plan, whether through her own perception of her older son's fury or through some report that reached her, and she moves quickly to save the son she has already risked so much to elevate. She sends Jacob away, framing it to Isaac as a search for a wife among her own relatives rather than as the flight from murder it actually is. And Jacob leaves the only home he has ever known, with nothing but a promise from his mother that she would send for him when it was safe to return. That promise is never fulfilled. Rebekah dies while Jacob is gone, and he never sees his mother again after the morning he walked out wearing his brother's clothes. What follows is 20 years in the household of his uncle Laban, and I want to spend a little time here because this stretch of the story is so often rushed past on the way to the more dramatic scenes still ahead. And yet it may be the most important 20 years of Jacob's entire life, precisely because of how ordinary, how grinding, how thoroughly unglamorous they are. Laban, it turns out, is a deceiver in his own right, cut from strikingly similar cloth to his nephew. And Jacob spends 2 decades discovering exactly what it feels like to be on the receiving end of the very kind of manipulation he had once practiced on his own father. He falls in love with Laban's younger daughter Rachel and agrees to work 7 years for the right to marry her. And the text tells us those 7 years seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. One of the tenderest sentences in the whole of Genesis, sitting right in the middle of a story otherwise thick with deception. But on the wedding night, in the darkness, Laban substitutes his elder daughter Leah in Rachel's place, and Jacob does not discover the substitution until morning, when it is far too late to undo it. There is something almost unbearably precise in this reversal, and I do not think the ancient author placed it here by accident. Jacob, who once deceived his own father in the dark by pretending to be someone he was not, is himself deceived in the dark by a father figure substituting one child for another. The very shape of his own sin is handed back to him, wearing different clothes, in a story that seems determined to make sure he understands, eventually, exactly what it feels like to stand where Esau once stood. He works another 7 years for Rachel. He endures Laban changing his wages, the text says, 10 times over the course of their years together. He builds, through relentless and often exhausted labor, a large family and considerable flocks of his own. And through all of it, there is a growing sense, carried in the small details the text gives us, of a man wearing thin under the weight of a life built almost entirely on watchfulness, on constantly calculating his next move against a household that had never once, in 20 years, dealt with him in plain honesty. Eventually, God tells Jacob it is time to return to the land of his fathers, and Jacob gathers his wives and children and flocks and sets out for home, for the very land where his brother, as far as he knows, is still waiting, 20 years older now, with whatever intention toward Jacob's life that exceedingly great and bitter cry had planted in him all those years ago. I want to linger a moment longer on what those 20 years actually did to Jacob before we follow him back across the border, because I think it is easy, moving quickly toward the more dramatic scenes still ahead, to miss how much quiet reshaping happened in the meantime. This was not a man who spent 2 decades untouched by his circumstances, arriving at the Jabbok exactly the same schemer he had been when he left his father's tent. The Jacob who worked those long years for Laban buried a mother he never saw again. He watched 2 wives compete for his love and his attention, in a household thick with a rivalry he had not chosen and could not fully calm. A rivalry that in its own way mirrored, uncomfortably, the very sibling wound he had inflicted on his own brother years before. He labored, the text tells us elsewhere in his own words, through the heat of the day and the frost of the night, sleep fleeing from his eyes, for wages that were changed against him again and again by a man he had trusted to deal with him honestly. Whatever cleverness Jacob still carried by the time he finally turned back toward home, it had been worn thin by 20 years of a life that gave him ample opportunity to learn, slowly and expensively, exactly how it felt to be on the losing end of the very deceptions he had once specialized in delivering to others. Chapter 4. The Messengers and the Fear. Jacob sends messengers ahead of him to Esau, hoping perhaps to test the waters before he arrives in person, instructing them to speak to his brother with careful deference, calling Esau his lord and himself Esau's servant, a striking reversal of the very blessing he had once stolen, which had promised that his brothers would bow down to him. The messengers return with news that stops Jacob cold. Esau is coming to meet him, they say, and he is bringing 400 men. The text does not leave any ambiguity about what this news does to Jacob. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. 20 years of running, 20 years of building a life far from home, and in a single sentence delivered by frightened messengers, all of it collapses back down into the same terror that sent him fleeing in the first place. 400 men is not the retinue of a brother arriving to reconcile. It is, or at least it could easily be, an army. Jacob's response to this fear is worth studying closely, because it shows us a man employing every strategy he has ever learned. The calculation of the boy who traded stew for a birthright, the caution of the man who spent 20 years reading Laban's moods before Laban could act on them, all of it deployed now in a single desperate attempt to survive the reckoning he has spent his entire adult life trying to avoid. He divides his people and flocks into 2 camps, reasoning that if Esau attacks one camp, the other might still escape. He prays, and the prayer itself is worth pausing on, because it is one of the most honest prayers in the whole of Genesis, stripped of any of the performance we might expect from a man who has spent his life managing appearances. I'm not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant, he says. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me. And then, having prayed, Jacob does what Jacob has always done. He goes back to calculating. He selects an enormous gift from his flocks, hundreds of goats and sheep and camels and cattle and donkeys, and sends them ahead of him in separate droves, each with instructions for the servant driving it to tell Esau, when asked, that this is a present from Jacob, sent ahead to find favor in his brother's sight. For he thought, the text tells us, with a bluntness that lets us see straight into the calculation, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. Notice what Jacob is still doing here, even in the middle of his terror, even after praying as honestly as he has ever prayed in his life. He is still managing the outcome, still working the angles, still trying to purchase, with carefully staged gifts and careful words, the reconciliation he cannot bring himself to simply walk toward and ask for directly. 20 years have changed the shape of his fear, but they have not yet changed the man underneath it. He sends everyone across the river ahead of him that night. His wives, his children, his servants, all his possessions, everything he has built across 2 decades of exile, All of it crosses the ford of the Jabbok in the darkness, and Jacob is left, for the first time in longer than the text has cared to tell us, entirely alone. Chapter 5. Alone at the river. And Jacob was left alone, 4 words, sitting by themselves in the text, and I want you to feel the full weight of them before we go any further, because everything that happens next in this story happens specifically because of what those 4 words describe. No servants, no wives, no children, no flocks, no gifts, no messengers, no careful arrangements dividing his household into camps in case of disaster. Every strategy he has ever relied on, every calculation, every buffer he has ever placed between himself and the consequences of his own choices, has been sent across the river ahead of him, and Jacob stands alone in the dark on the near bank, with nothing left to manage and no one left to manipulate on his behalf. And it is here, in that emptied, undefended, entirely alone place, that a man wrestles with him until the breaking of the day. The text does not tell us who this man is, not at first. And I want to honor that ambiguity the way the ancient author clearly intended it to be honored, rather than rushing past it toward the answer we already know from the chapter's ending. Jacob himself in the moment does not know who has come to wrestle him in the dark. It could be, for all he knows in that first terrifying instant, an assassin sent ahead of Esau's 400 men, arriving early to finish what the morning was meant to bring. It could be a river spirit, the kind ancient Near Eastern tradition, often placed at fords and crossings, guarding the boundary between one territory and the next. Jacob does not have the luxury in the dark, wrestling for his life against a stranger whose face he cannot see, of understanding the full theological weight of what is happening to him. He only has the wrestling itself, hour after hour, through what the text implies is the entire remaining length of the night. I want you to sit with the physicality of this scene, because it is so often flattened in retelling into something more abstract than what the text actually gives us. This is not a metaphorical struggle. It is described in the plain, muscular language of an actual physical contest, 2 bodies straining against each other in the dark, neither one able to fully overcome the other, hour bleeding into hour, until the man wrestling with Jacob, seeing that he could not prevail against him, does something that changes the entire register of the scene in a single motion. He touches Jacob's hip socket, and Jacob's hip is put out of joint as he wrestles with him. Everything before this moment could plausibly have been read as an ordinary contest between 2 matched physical opponents, however strange the circumstances. This single detail ends that possibility completely. No human opponent disables a joint with a touch. Whatever force Jacob has been wrestling against all night, it has, until this moment, been holding back, matching Jacob's own strength rather than overwhelming it, allowing the contest to continue on something closer to equal terms than the being's actual power would ever require. And now, with the night nearly spent, it reveals in a single gesture exactly how much strength it has been withholding all along. And here is where the story gives us the detail I think matters more than any other in the whole scene. Jacob's hip is dislocated. The pain of that alone would end most contests immediately, would send most men to the ground, gasping, finished. Jacob does not let go. Chapter 6. I will not let you go. Then he said, Let me go, for the day is breaking. And Jacob, hip wrenched from its socket, exhausted from a night of wrestling something he still does not fully understand, gives the answer that has echoed across 3,000 years of readers who have found themselves in their own darkest nights, understanding exactly why he said it. I will not let you go unless you bless me. I want you to consider what kind of man says this. Not a man overpowering his opponent, because the dislocated hip has already told us that Jacob was never actually winning this contest in any conventional sense. A man who has been brought by pain and by exhaustion and by the ending night to the absolute limit of what his own strength can accomplish, and who chooses in that limit not to release his grip but to tighten it, Everything Jacob has ever done in his life up to this point, the trading for the birthright, the deception in his father's tent, the 20 years of careful calculation under Laban's roof, the elaborate gifts sent ahead to purchase Esau's mercy, all of it has been the work of a man trying to secure blessing through cleverness, through strategy, through being one step ahead of whoever stood between him and what he wanted. And here, finally, stripped of every strategy, unable to outmaneuver or outcalculate the being who has just disabled him with a single touch, Jacob discovers the one thing that was actually available to him all along, the thing his cleverness had always let him avoid needing. Not cunning, not strategy. Simple, desperate, physical refusal to let go. The being asks him a question that should sound familiar to anyone who has followed this story from its beginning. "What is your name?" And Jacob answers honestly, the way he answered dishonestly once before in his father's dark tent, when he was asked almost the identical question and lied his way into a blessing that was never his to take. "Jacob," he says, "the grasper, the deceiver." He speaks his own name into the dark, the full weight of everything that name has meant across every year of his life, without flinching from it and without hiding behind it. And the being answers him with words that reshape the whole of who Jacob understood himself to be. "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." I want to slow down on this new name, because its meaning carries the entire theology of this story compressed into a single word. Israel, built from Hebrew roots that most scholars understand, to mean something close to he strives with God, or God strives, or in some readings, let God prevail. The exact grammar has been debated for centuries, and I will not pretend to settle it here. But whatever the precise translation, the name carries within it something Jacob's old name never could. Jacob named a grasping, a deception, an identity built around outmaneuvering whoever stood in his way. Israel names a struggle, honestly undertaken, honestly endured, and somehow, despite the dislocated hip, despite the wound that will mark him for the rest of his life, a struggle in which he is told he has prevailed. Notice what prevailing means in this story, because it is nothing like what prevailing has meant in every earlier chapter of Jacob's life. He doesn't prevail by defeating the one he wrestles. He prevails by refusing to release his grip even after he has been wounded, by holding on long enough and honestly enough to receive, at last, through struggle, rather than through deception, the blessing he had once stolen in the dark from a father who could not see him clearly. Jacob asks the being's name in return, and the answer he receives is a kind of gentle refusal. "Why is it that you ask my name?" And then, without further explanation, the being blesses him there. Chapter 7. The face of God and the rising sun. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." I want you to feel the astonishment carried inside that naming, because in the wider ancient world Jacob inhabited, and indeed across much of the biblical tradition itself, the idea of seeing God's face directly and surviving it was understood to be close to impossible. Later in the story of Israel, Moses will ask to see God's glory and be told plainly that no one can see God's face and live, that he will be permitted only to glimpse God's back as it passes by, shielded even then from the fullness of what a direct encounter would mean for a mortal body to withstand. And here, generations before Moses, in the dark, alone, wrestling something that would not name itself, Jacob emerges from the encounter not merely alive, but marked, blessed, and renamed, having looked, in whatever sense the text intends this, directly into the face of the God he wrestled all night without releasing his grip. The sun rises upon him as he passes Penuel, and here the text gives us a detail so quietly devastating that it is easy to read past it in the relief of the blessing just received. He was limping because of his hip. The blessing did not undo the wound. The new name did not restore the dislocated joint to the way it had been before the night began. Jacob walks forward into the rest of his life, into the reunion with Esau, still waiting for him just beyond the horizon of this scene, carrying both things at once, permanently, inseparably, the blessing and the limp, the new identity and the visible cost of having received it. I think this is the single most important thing this ancient story has to teach anyone listening tonight who is carrying their own wound alongside whatever blessing they have managed, against every odd, to hold on to. The tradition does not offer you a version of transformation that arrives without cost. It does not tell you that becoming who you are actually meant to be will leave you unmarked. Jacob walks with a limp for the rest of his recorded life, mentioned again decades later as an old man leaning on his staff. And Jacob also walks, from this morning forward, as Israel, the name an entire nation would eventually carry, the name spoken over prophets and psalms and centuries of a people who would trace their whole identity back to this single dark and wounding night beside a river none of them ever saw. The blessing and the wound were never in competition with each other in this story. They arrived together from the same hand, in the same night, and neither one, the text insists quietly, through every detail it chooses to preserve, was ever going to arrive without the other. Chapter 8, what Jacob carried across the river to meet his brother. I want to close tonight, the way this whole tradition has taught us to close, by turning from the ancient story toward whatever it is you are carrying into this room right now, because I do not think the story of Jacob at the Jabbok was preserved across 3,000 years, told and retold at Passover tables and in synagogues and in churches across every continent, simply to record a strange and violent encounter beside a river. It was preserved because it names something true about the way real transformation actually happens, and it refuses, with a stubbornness that has outlasted every softer retelling anyone has ever tried to layer over it, to let that transformation come cheaply. There are three kinds of people, I think, who might hear their own night beside the river in this story tonight. The first is the person who has spent years, the way Jacob spent 20, running from a moment they cannot undo, building an entire life at a careful distance from the reckoning they suspect is still waiting for them somewhere ahead. If that is you tonight, I want you to notice what actually happened when Jacob finally could not run any further, when every strategy and every buffer he had built across 2 decades was sent across the river ahead of him, and he was left, for the first time in longer than the story tells us, entirely alone with what he had done. The wrestling that found him there was not a punishment arriving late. It was, in the end, the very thing that let him walk forward, changed, limping, but no longer running, toward the brother he had wronged and the reconciliation he had spent 20 years assuming was impossible. The second is the person who is, right now, in the middle of their own long night of struggle, wrestling with something that has not yet told them its name, uncertain whether what they are fighting is meant to harm them or to bless them, uncertain even whether they are going to survive until the sun comes up. If that is you, hear what Jacob discovered only at the very end of the night, after every hour of exhausting, unresolved struggle. The wrestling itself was never separate from the blessing. It was the road the blessing had to travel down in order to reach him. You do not have to know yet what the being you are wrestling intends. You are only asked to do the one thing Jacob did after every strategy had failed him. Hold on. The third is the person who has already received their new name, in whatever form that renaming has taken in their own life, and who is still, months or years later, limping from whatever it cost to receive it. If that is you tonight, I want you to hear this plainly, because I think it is the quietest and most durable comfort this whole ancient story has to offer. The limp was never a sign that the blessing had failed to take hold. It was the mark of how real the wrestling had actually been. Israel walked with a limp for the rest of his life, And Israel is also the name an entire nation would carry forward for 3,000 years afterward. And the story never once asks you to choose between those two truths. You are allowed tonight to be both marked and blessed, wounded and renamed all at once, carried forward out of your own river the very same way Jacob was carried out of his into a morning he did not know, until the sun actually rose on it, that he would be permitted to see at all. The river is quiet now. Whatever wrestled with Jacob in the dark released its hold at the breaking of the day. The way every long night eventually gives way to morning, however reluctantly, however much the body still aches from everything it held onto in the hours before the light came. Somewhere just beyond the horizon of this story, Esau is already approaching with his 400 men, and Jacob, newly named, still limping, walks forward to meet him anyway. You do not have to know yet how your own morning ends. You're only asked tonight to rest, the way even a wrestler eventually rests, blessed and wounded in the very same breath, held by whatever it was that would not let him go until the blessing had actually been given. Sleep now. The night by the river is over, and you are held the way Jacob was finally held, not in spite of the struggle, but because of everything the struggle cost you to survive. Good night.